Welcome, everybody, to our first colloquium of the winter term. Uh, Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Andrew David Bjork, who will be talking about a learning situation in CS Unplugged, sorting algorithms. Andrew David Bjork was born in California, but moved to France when he was 2, and this is directly relevant. He completed his schooling in the French school system until moving back to California for college. He majored in mathematics at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, earned a Master of Arts degree in mathematics from UCSB, go Gauchos, a teaching credential certificate from CSUN, and a PhD in mathematics from UC Irvine. His specialty was in logic, with a thesis on applications of descriptive set theory to ergodic theory. He was hired as an assistant professor of mathematics in 2009 at Siena Heights University in Adrian, Michigan. There he taught and mentored students for the past 14 years, serving as chair of the Committee on Liberal Arts Program Coordinator, CIS Program Coordinator, and finally, Math Program Coordinator. He reached the rank of full professor and successfully applied for a sabbatical semester for research in Pau, France. Today's talk is the fruit of this trip and the research that has ensued. Thank you, Andrew David.
Thank you, and welcome, everybody. This was 2022, spring term, I guess it would be. After a bit of a delay because of, well, complications with visas, I did manage to get to France. And I have some pictures to share at the end if we have time. So pictures are always nice. But I'm going to spend most of today giving you a little bit of a background on how the French have started really working in math education, specifically in developing both methodology and evaluation tools for creating situations that target specific knowings in mathematics. So here's an overview of the talk. I'll go over some of the theoretical background. Most of this I really didn't know until about 5 years ago. This is really when I started looking into this. And one of the things that I was able to do is there was a week in April while I was in France that had a full intensive workshops at a resort in the Alps. So the professor I was working with, Patrick Gibel, and myself went there, and I was able to get some workshop experience in all of these different techniques and practices. So what I'm sharing with you is kind of the fruit of what I learned there, as well as the research that I did while I was there. The main focus is on the theory of didactical situations. And in particular, the situation we implemented is not in mathematics, but in the unplugged version of computer science. So most computer science classrooms, you probably think that there's a bunch of people typing code into a machine and instructing and compiling and chasing bugs. And this does happen quite a bit. But there's a whole branch where you're thinking about how do we create the code before we start coding? What is algorithms? How do we know if they're effective or not, regardless of the language in which we're coding? And so this is really about that aspect of computer science. So back in the 70s, like most people, I think, or most places around the world, France was very traditional in how they taught, specifically in mathematics. But they realized that some changes needed to happen. And so in particular, they wanted to develop some rigorous methodologies, scientific methodologies, to study math education in particular. So they targeted 4 questions specifically. So D1 here is, how is scientific knowledge taught and learned in and out of school? Broader than math, but definitely math falls into scientific knowledge. The second one is, given a mathematical subject like algebra, geometry, analysis, whatever, or a concept like symmetries, proportionalities, functions, What are the relationships between the ideas that are taught and what the learners actually learn, and then the mathematical frames of reference? These are very broad questions and are often difficult to assess and to target specifically. And then the last two, how do we bridge the gap between the math that is taught and mathematical theory? How are situations designed so that we can ensure that the gap gets bridged? And then the last question is, what are the curricular choices that can be made to ensure the retention of mathematical knowledge in students? If we think about these four questions, I think they're applicable to a lot of disciplines. But these were really the driving force that confronted the researchers in education in France. And so they crafted 3 different theoretical frameworks to address these, because any single one would not be sufficient. So the lead researchers in the 3 fields were Vergniaud, Chavelard, and Brousseau. Vergniaud coined the theory of conceptual fields, Chavelard the anthropological theory of didactics, and Brousseau the theory of didactical situations. So we'll start briefly with the theory of conceptual fields. This really follows more of the psychological and didactical perspectives. Very much he was a student of Piaget. Piaget was actually his advisor for his thesis. So, I mean, it's the French school of math education, of course. Constructivism would be there. The driving hypothesis is that new pieces of knowledge have to be built off of the old understanding, but only after that understanding has been shown to fail, right? So the learner has to be convinced of the inadequacy of what they held as truth before they're ready to do that cognitive shift for the new learning to occur and a new model to work within their frame of reference. So Vergniaud developed descriptive tools that really address the questions D1 and D2 previously. The key ideas here is that you have your learners that are being observed in action in a situation, in a classroom, in an environment, what the French call a milieu. Researchers then identify schemes that are employed by the learning that are employed within this situation, and the rules and the beliefs that are being used by the students are called theorems in act. The conceptual field itself consists of all the different situations, schemes, symbols used, and these theorems in the act that appear in the learning. In practice, experimental designs using this theory tend to be long-term. What you do is you have a study that establishes what the theorems in the act are, and then you're trying to develop tools to force the learner to reject old beliefs in order to correct and then understand the new learning in a more correct way. The next theory is the anthropological theory of didactics. So this is really looking more as an entire environment of where the learning is occurring. We're viewing a classroom not in isolation, but as part of a whole ecosystem of learning environments. You're in a classroom within a school. You're in a context that is both spatial and time dependent. And you're looking at how the learning is changing as the piece of knowledge goes from one setting to another, from a university, a grade school, a high school, all of these places. As the learning is shifting, as the ideas are shifting, different things are being taught, even though it's supposed to be the same content. So this idea of the piece of knowledge is different, though it's the same. This is called the didactic transposition. Think of it as the idea of integers. A mathematician has a very different idea of what an integer is than a kindergarten teacher. And that difference is a didactic transposition. the context is completely relevant to how a student is going to learn. So the key idea of the anthropological theory of didactics is that of praxeology. The theory views how a particular mathematical knowledge and understanding exist in a given situation and studies the formal ecology of the idea. The praxeological goals are to describe and help understand this very ecology and how the praxeologies change as a piece of mathematics goes from one institution to another is precisely what we mean by didactic transposition. So there's really four aspects to a praxeology. There's the type of task, big T. There's a technique to accomplish this task, little tau. There's a technology, little theta, which is a narrative that justifies using the technique. And there's a theory, capital theta, from mathematics, which grounds the pieces of knowledge at stake. And of course, all of these are forms of T. Praxeologies can be developed over entire curricula or just a particular lesson. It really depends on what you're trying to address. While I was in the workshop in the Alps, we were in small groups developing particular praxeologies to address a very specific lesson that we were given. It was a very interesting workshop. I felt like a complete fish out of water as I was trying to understand what the word praxeology really meant in this context, but it was quite fun. But what really drew me to this school of learning and understanding how we learn is the theory of didactic situations itself. Guy Brousseau was an elementary school teacher who decided to get a PhD because he thought that how he understood how his students learned was not what was being described in the things he was learning. And so he crafted this theory as his PhD work. And the idea of the theory is to design situations that specifically target a particular piece of mathematical knowledge. And we're going to get into this a little bit deeper. So these are really questions of the type O1 and O2 is what this theory is supposed to address. So the key idea is this. You're going to design a learning situation, and there's going to be a piece of mathematical knowledge at stake. The learner is going to engage in the situation, and the teacher will only manage the situation. The situations themselves have to contain elements that are adidactical in nature. In other words, no direct instruction from the teacher. It's going to be the discovery of the student that is the origination of the learning. Here's some of the basic methodologies. TDS revolves around the designing of these learning situations. One of the things that makes it different from anthropological didactics or the theory of lexical fields, cognitive fields, is really the idea of doing an analysis on the situation before you run the situation itself. The French call this a priori analysis, analyse a priori. And this analysis happens at many levels. You have a mathematical analysis of the situation, and you're trying to target the strategies that will be needed by the student to achieve success in the learning strategies. You have a didactical analysis, which will target the conditions that are necessary for the learning to happen. And then you might even be positing about which conditions they are and which may not be there. And then you will have a full description of the experimental setup. Coupled with this pre-analysis, you then do a post-analysis where you're either going to accept or reject the hypotheses that were being formed. You're going to gather your data and you're going to look at the evidence to see if those indicators that you said should be present were. That was the preamble. So now let's get into the actual situation. It makes a lot more sense once you start seeing what the situation is. Examples are always a good idea. So start with a finite list, A sub n. Hey, it's starting to look like math. Mathematicians all around the world rejoice right about now. We're going to have a less than ordering on this list. The goal of a sorting on the list is going to create a less than totally ordered list, A sub Pn, and P sub n is just a permutation on the indices of the list. So it's just rearranging, a swapping of the elements of the list. Of course, such a Pn can be made up entirely of transpositions. You can always just take two. Enough of these can reshuffle any ordering that we want. This is a theorem of mathematics. So sorting algorithms in particular require either a human or a machine to take the role of comparing two elements. They're going to make sure that the less than is being obeyed everywhere, and then switching them according to the ordering. So I'm going to show you three such algorithms here, just so you can see how they work. So the left one is cocktail sort. What's happening is that 2 by 2, the two next to each other are being compared and going from left to right and then right to left, up and down. So you can kind of picture bubbles rising and falling as sugar falls in your cocktail. I guess that's why it's called a cocktail sort. The one in the middle is bubble sort. Again, you just have 2 by 2 comparisons, but you always go left to right and you always go in the same order. So it's as if bubbles just keep rising through your sorting list. Insertion sort is actually kind of interesting. What you're doing is you're creating larger and larger completely sorted lists. So you start with 2, then you grab the third thing, and you compare them. And once you find something that's smaller than it, you stop. And you just keep grabbing the next one in the list, and you just compare until you know where it fits within the list. So you're inserting the new element of the list into the already ordered set that you've created. This is why everything to the left of the red dots here on the right is already sorted, and everything to the right is not. The research situation that we actually created was with the help of Patrick Gibel. So Patrick Gibel is a professor and researcher at the University of Bordeaux. He is stationed in Pau, which is where I went. The reason I asked Patrick if I could come and work with him is his PhD advisor was Guy Brousseau, which was the closest I could get to the source because Guy Brousseau no longer is actively researching. And I just wanted to learn with the people who'd created the stuff. So this was a unique opportunity for me. It turns out Patrick is the most generous, engaging person I could have hoped for. Never hesitated, embraced me with open arms, wonderful welcome, and a wonderful person to work with. While we were there, we met with Marina Rafalska, who is a Ukrainian researcher currently at the Université Côte d'Azur. So she's in Nice on the Mediterranean coast. And the last person of the research team is Pierre Brumeau. He's a high school teacher locally at the Lycée de Naï. And he'd worked with Patrick before in didactic situations. So he already had quite a good working knowledge of how to run these situations and what he was wanting to see happen within the class with his students. So all of us met together to design the situation, to do the a priori analysis, to actually capture the data. And now we are still collaborating in terms of analyzing the data and writing papers to share what we found. So the implementation that we did for this particular situation was in a 12th grade high school class in computer science. NSE is the actual name of the course. Marina Rafalska is the one that created the game that we had the students play and had actually run this game with a variety of different levels, from 5th grade 7th grade and 10th graders she'd already had. So she had data, she had seen how it was done in different classrooms, and she's written some papers explaining some of this. I don't know if any of them are published yet or not, but the situation we ran here is the one that we put together for these particular students. So let me explain what the game is. What is this situation? So you have one set of cards like this, but you only take one suit. Out of the suit of 13 cards, you ask the students to choose only 7, and they do not look at them. So they're just face down. They put them in a line in front of them face down. And then what they do is they take 2, they look at them, order them, and put them back in the order that they wish on the 2 empty spots that we're picking up. They repeat this until they are satisfied that all of the cards are sorted. When the cards are in front of them, they're face down, so they don't know what they are. So they can only see what the cards say when they pick them up and look at them. And for this initial game, they can take as long as they want, and they sort through. So the first stage of all of these situations is always one where you want your students to interact with the game, learn to play it by the rules correctly, but also experience success, have fun, and really get familiar with the interface of the manipulative. So I have a video that will show you the first game of a pair of students here playing. Will I play? There we go. So picks up 2 cards, reorders them, puts them back down. Is verifying with his partner that he's following the rules correctly. I did speed up the video a little bit. You want all the students to do this phase of the game 3 or 4 times to make sure that they have both success and full knowledge of the rules. And then at the end, they flip them all over and see if they succeeded. Oh. So the second game, it's basically the same gameplay. It's the same thing. The main difference is that this time the students are in pairs, and there is one of the students that is going to give instructions to the other student. The one that gives instructions tells the other student which 2 cards to look at, but doesn't get to see them. The student who sees them only implements the shuffling between the 2 if they need to be rearranged, and then puts them back down and never shows those cards to the student who was giving the instructions. So the order giver basically implements the algorithm, or gives the rules for the algorithm, and then the executioner just plays the role of a CPU in a way. He's just processing the orders and trying to see what happens. So let me show you that in action. So different pair. So notice that we provided a reference sheet with an arrow so that they knew which way to order the cards. The reaction that people have as they're given the instructions and they realize that this time they won't see the value of the cards is really interesting. Some people start getting happy, others a little bit scared, because the strategies they used when they were just goofing off usually relied on memory, and now they can't use that anymore. It's fairly typical that the first try is not a success, but some groups succeeded right off the bat. So interesting to note. Game 3. So each time we play a game, we're trying to introduce more and more difficulty to force the outcome that we're trying to get the students to reach. And so in the third game, the main difference is we have one person giving orders, and then we have 3 students with 3 different decks that are shuffled independently and that are executing the orders simultaneously. And so the instructions that the instruction giver gives have to sort all 3 decks at the same time. And the reason we use 3 is specifically to overload the memory of the person giving instructions so that they cannot keep track of whether the cards were being swapped or not. So we're trying to make sure that they cannot be efficient in solving, right? No shortcuts, but it forces them to get more and more generic in the algorithms that they end up creating. So we identified the following didactical variables. So we have the size of the deck that the cards are drawn from. We just did from one suit, but we could have done something else. So big N is 13 for all of these. How many cards are drawn? Once they are done with a 7-card deck, and if it's too easy, we have them draw 10. Make it a little bit more difficult. Make sure that the method that they're creating can handle that extra level of complexity. And then the number of simultaneous executors. Eventually, by game 4, we require that the entire class can execute at the same time. And then we will say the method works if the whole class of decks is sorted by the end of the execution instructions. So the first session that we had, first the rules of the game have to be given to the students. This is called a devolution because we only want to give enough instructions that the students play the rules without hinting at any methods and not using the word sort ever. So all of these students had learned the sorting algorithms, the classical one, the year previously. But the year previous was 2021. And y'all remember what happened in 2021? It turns out that during COVID in this particular high school, what they did is every week, half the students came in and the other half were online remotely, so that the classrooms were distanced, but everybody got to have all of the instruction. It's just that half were in person on one week, and then the other half were in person the following week. So that's how they did it. But because of this, much to the instructor's chagrin, he wasn't able to do any fun learning activities while teaching these concepts. And so really he just lectured, gave the algorithms, gave examples, and told them to implement it. What was fascinating is as we were watching these students and they were doing this, they had no idea that we were asking them to come up with sorting algorithms. And part of it is we were very, very careful not to use the word sort at any point. But also it's because it was a context of a card game. And this was just enough removed from what they were doing and what they expected that they didn't think in terms of material that they already had from the course. So that part actually was successful in terms of our design. So after each play of the game, we had the students actually write down the methods that they had tried and how it went, whether it was a success and a failure. We had the students play in pairs, and we needed to code is this didactic? Is this adidactic? And the way we designed the situation is we really wanted day one to be mostly adidactical. By day two, we had much more didactic interventions from the teacher. Specifically, one of the groups was far behind the other three groups. So they just needed a little bit more prompting, a little bit more direction. Scaffolding is what we would call it here. But in France, they just call it direct instruction. And then the end of our first session, we actually had groups of 4, and students were playing game 3 by the end. So this was a 2-hour session this first day. The second session, we had them play game 3 again, so in groups of 4, and then we asked them to perform the situation of formulation. And by this, what we mean is we asked them to come up with a completely generic methodology that could work for any size deck P. And their method should be able to sort any number of decks at the same time. And so they were asked to really reflect on this in a much more abstract way, but they still had access to the cards and they had access to each other. And so this really is one of the key points of the theory of didactic situations. You need to have a space where the students are trying to formulate the theory of what it is they've been practicing. It's not enough just to do. You have to be able to say as well. And then we had them reflect on what they were doing, and their task was to come up with a method that would work so that they could implement this method in the third session. For the third session, each one of the groups had to present their generalized method for sorting the cards. And this is the actual place where the formulation of the sorting algorithms occurred. And it wasn't until this very day and the end of this session that the instructor formalized what was happening and was able to tell them, hey, these are the sorting algorithms you learned last year. This here's bubble sort, this here's cocktail sort, this is, and that was really eye-opening for the students. So that part of the phase is always called the institutionalization. This is where the knowledge now becomes part of the collective knowing of the class and can be referred to by anybody. The didactical répertoire didactique. Think of this as the breadth of knowledge and the knowings that are available to each of the students coming into it. We had to list all of the things that we thought the students knew. So this is where we talked about what happened the previous year, what we thought the students would be doing, and this is part of the a priori analysis, right? We're trying to guess, are they going to recognize what's going on? Are they going to say the word sort? Are they going to fill in the blank? So this was kind of scary to think about beforehand. Marina had never run this with students who had seen and been taught sorting algorithms before. So she was really concerned that this would just flat out fail. But no, they had no idea. It was glorious. So the analysis that we were able to come up with, we were able to find that this truly was an authentic situation because of this. The students genuinely had not constructed in their own minds what these things were, how they worked, and what they were used for. They couldn't recall them when they needed them, and they couldn't recognize them once they knew what it was. So this really meant that whatever had been taught the year before, none of it had been absorbed, which was fascinating. So we thought about the obstacles that would come in their way, right? So we had to list some of the things that we were concerned about. How are the students actually going to generate a generic sorting algorithms? Are they going to draw things? Are we going to ask them to draw? Are we going to invite them to? Do we need to make sure that there's language being developed that the whole class can use as they are doing this? And we did find some instances of these things happening. What are they going to need to be able to say to communicate effectively? In particular, when you go from game 2 to game 3, in game 2 and the video I showed you, you saw the students pointing at 2 cards. But when you have 3 people, you have 2 on the other side and 1 next to you. And so if you point at the 2 same cards, how does the person next to you know which 2 cards you want? Do you see what I'm getting at? And so this difficulty, they had to find a way to deal with. And most of the groups realized that they could number the spots, right, the places where the cards came from, and then they just give the instruction 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5. And so that very, very quickly became the language that they used. But we had to think about, is this something they're going to need? And at what point, if we don't see it appear, do we intervene and give that to them? Another thing, aces. We had different types of decks. In a French deck, the ace is actually the number 1. In a US deck, the ace is the letter A. So these are different. And so we then had to decide, because we had both English and French decks in the same classroom, so we had to decide, are we going to treat aces high or low? So we went with low, just so that the ones would be consistent. And it turns out it didn't provide any difficulty for the students, but we had to make sure we thought about it and listed it in our a priori analysis. We had to think about, how are the students going to keep track of things? When are we going to ask them to write things down and reflect? How are we going to gather that data? Yeah, so if we don't have a communal way of talking about something, then are the students going to find that they give instructions and maybe some groups won't know how to implement them? So this is definitely a possibility. So it's kind of fun to, sit down and think of the possible obstacles. And this is part of the design of the situation. You have to go through all of these. Then we have to think about, well, what do we do to accommodate? What are some of the teacher moves that we're going to allow? So the frame of reference, maybe the teacher's the one who's going to have to number the spaces for the students. Maybe the teacher's going to have to suggest that they play the game but look at the cards so they can see what's happening to them, so that they can devise better strategies for sorting. Maybe the teacher is going to have to actually come alongside a particular group and intervene and scaffold right on the fly. And the instructor we had, Pierre Brumeau, was very, very good, and he spotted right away the group that was struggling. And we captured all of this in video. It was really, really nice. So that's part of the data we have to analyze. And this is the reality of implementation versus theory, is that you see where the things work, where they break down, and how an experienced instructor makes a big difference in the actual learning of the students that seem to be falling through the gap of a particular lesson. Validations are crucial in any situation. The validation is, how does a student know that what they did worked, right? And so our validation system here is, you flip over all the cards, and if they're sorted, you win. So you have this built-in empirical validation that's just so, so crucial. And it's so constructive to have that right there. You can also have, sometimes you're not sure whether what you did was implemented correctly, right? So you could set up 2 decks that are shuffled exactly the same way, and then verify having 2 different people implement the same instructions, just to make sure, double check that your method worked versus that it's somebody who didn't actually do it right. Because human error is a possibility when you're sorting by hand. And then students can actually write mathematical proofs to justify why they know it's going to be sorted. And some did, and it was really interesting to see. So the anticipated procedures, this is what we suspect was starting to show at each stage of the games, right? So for the first game, we were really thinking we would see mostly things that would happen due to memory. So no generic strategies really whatsoever. Um, just random moves. And that's what we saw that first kid play in the video. He had no purpose. He was just choosing two things and putting them in right order and kept choosing two things and then stopped when he was, okay, I guess I'm done. And then looked at him and, oh, it didn't work, right? And that's really what you want to see happening the first time because you're just futzing around. Very quickly, people who are competitive are going to start implementing, memorizing where pieces are, trying to get the biggest one on one side, smallest somewhere else. And because you have unlimited moves in the first game, it doesn't matter. You're going to get there, right? So you just have to be stubborn enough, you're going to win. But it's too easy of a game to force generic algorithms to spawn. Second game, we actually identified all sorts of pre-algorithms that we were hoping to start seeing. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we're really looking at the beginning stages of the different classic algorithms. So we're looking at a pre-bubble sort, a pre-cocktail sort. We were looking at, maybe they would skip over, like do what they call a saut de mouton. It's an expression in French. It just means sheep jumping. I mean, yeah, as long as they don't fall asleep, right? There's a pre-insert sorting, a pre-selection sorting. Oh, I didn't talk about sorting by selection. This is the one where you choose like the biggest spot and then compare it against everybody else, and then that's the biggest. Then the second biggest compared against everybody lower, that's going to be the second biggest, and you keep going until they're all sorted. So those were really the four sorting algorithms we were hoping to see, right? Bubble sort, cocktail sort, insert sort, and selection sort. By game 3, we were really hoping to see fully developed of these sorting algorithms, and we did, and some were still somewhat hybrid. Some had like a weird initial phase where you played a weird game the first round, and then after that you followed one of these classic algorithms. And I wanted to show you some of the artifacts that we collected. Well, part of it is French handwriting has to be in cursive. Did you know this? They still teach cursive in France. And everybody has to write with fountain pens. Yes, still to this day. So even math, you have to do in fountain pen. So this was my legacy all through schooling, all the way through high school. In this one, they're actually talking about the methods and what they're trying to do. So this is part of how we gathered the evidence that we were seeing these algorithms rise. Here you can see even better. We encouraged them to draw pictures of what they were doing if they were having a hard time with words. So here you can clearly see the sheep jumping, right? The one on top with the red arrows. And then below you just have kind of a bubble sort happening. And again, here you have the jumping sheep followed by a cocktail sort. So it's just kind of fun to see them and to see how they try to represent it. The next step, so after you gather all of these things, you need to find a way to analyze your data meaningfully. So some of the tools that we're using were, I'm kind of giving you some of the references here, but I think we're just going to skip this over a little bit and not go too deeply into this. But you're trying to find a grid and piece the different pieces of evidence that you see to fit within this grid so that you can isolate where the students are at each stage of the learning. Have they gone from the stage where they're just guessing to where they're starting to formulate, from formulating to actually having constructed something that resembles what you want, or to fully knowing what it is? At what point can they justify that their algorithm will always work? So those are all the things that we're trying to place in these grids to fully analyze where the learning occurred for each student. And So one of the tools that we're using to do this comes from Pierce's semiotics. So we're looking at the symbols that are being used by the students to indicate the different levels of understanding. So that concludes what I wanted to share with all of you. I do want to thank you for your time, for your attention, and I would open it up for questions.
Questions?
Should I take that? Is that all right? All right. Is this good? Okay. So you had mentioned that when you were presenting this activity to the students, you very specifically avoided using the word sort because you didn't want it to be framed that way. How did you frame it then in the context of a computer science class? Was it just like, hey, let's play a card game, no reason in specific?
We said you have to arrange the cards from least to greatest.
Though, I mean, in the context of a computer science class, like, did you just say, hey, let's do this, or was there a specific reason, or?
Yeah, so the students were told that the activity they were going to do was part of a research project, that it was related to computer science, but it didn't involve any machines at first.
Okay, yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Mhm.
Two questions. One of the things that you mentioned in your analysis was the fact that the teams, when they got together in groups of 4, would need some mechanism for identifying how to give the commands in such a way that all 3 people could follow the same thing. And you mentioned that there's a problem of they're developing their own language for that. I'm curious whether you considered building into the schemes some mechanism of shifting the groups around so that you deliberately would potentially have participants that spoke different languages about that to see how they would reconcile the fact that they all had potentially different ways of describing the same thing.
I think that could work, and it might be something that you do if you have a lot of students. We had a very small class, right? There were 12 students total, so we only had 3 groups of 4 going, which means that there wasn't really much of a chance for doing something like that. The other question then that you run into is how much time are you going to give this activity? So we had already targeted 3 2-hour sessions. That's about a full week of this course. And that's about all the teacher could afford to give to this.
Thank you. My second question is, you mentioned a few times that on game 1, they had sort of as many turns as they wanted to try to sort through. I didn't see anywhere in game 2 or 3, excuse me, where the number of turns was limited, but that's obviously one of the things you're interested in doing in sorts is building efficiency. Did you have them track that, or was it just sort of something that you let evolve on its own? If they wanted to think about efficiency, they could, but they didn't have to.
So it wasn't mentioned in game 2, it wasn't mentioned in game 3, but it was part of the devolution of game 4, where they were asked to craft an efficient strategy. So they were asked, what is the least number of moves that would be successful for a sorting method of this sort?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And they had to come up with a reason why that was the right number of moves for their method.
So what you mentioned reminds me a little bit of the Montessori method as well. I think just following along with the piece that the students, you give the students a situation, but the teacher kind of backs off and let them explore the learning. The next piece of the Montessori piece is allowing the students to continue that learning. So after you set up these situations, was there an opportunity for the students to say, now let's try it with the whole group? Can we get 60 people to do it? Like, how big could this get? And kind of following that process. Did they get that excited to be able to do that, I guess?
Yes, and in fact, it was part of the assignment of the game 4 that their method should work for arbitrarily large. But in particular, where we were going as a follow-up, from there, the idea at first was that from this, they would go to code their method into an implementation in the language that they were learning. So we definitely had that as part of what we initially wanted, but it took longer to get through the first 4 games than at first anticipated, so we didn't have time to get to that activity.
So did any of your students find any more sophisticated sorting algorithms like H-sort or Q-sort or any of those? Or was it limited to like selection and cocktail and insertion?
These were the only 4 that were come up with.
Right, okay. Interesting.
Mhm.
Did they consider, once you got to game 2 where you had an operator, did they consider a situation where the operator could see all of the cards and kind of observe how mistakes happened and things like that?
So interestingly enough, no, not until one of us suggested that they would do this. And this only tended to happen after they played game 3 a number of times. And as they're working on the fully generic solution for the 4th situation, that's when they were starting to play the game open-handed, so to say, right? So they could keep track of the movements and see really what their algorithm did.
Hey, I was really interested in the little snippets of classroom talk that we got, and I wondered if any analysis of classroom discourse was incorporated into like your analysis scheme at all, or if that was relevant to your research questions.
Yes, absolutely. So we recorded everything that happened in that classroom. So we had 3 different cameras going, and we recorded all the groups the whole time. So we have the full transcripts of all of that. And those are part of the indicators that we are looking at. What are the words they're using? How do the words correlate to what the pictures that they're drawing? Yes, we're linking all of those together. Absolutely. I do have some pictures if you would like to see some of the places and people during this. Let's see if I can just pull it up. Here we go. So I don't know how this works for the people online. It's good? Okay. So this is Patrick Gibel. We were just eating at a cafe. Charming, absolutely most welcoming host I ever could have dreamed of. I love him to pieces. He is fantastic. He not only researches didactics, he's also the math teacher trainer. So he works at an institution that prepares future teachers at all levels. And he also directs master's and PhD students in math education. So he wears a lot of different hats, and all of those hats are things that I'm interested in. So we connected absolutely at every level. And I can't wait to meet him again and do some more work with him. This has just been an incredible experience. This is a little restaurant in the Basque country that he took me to, right around the Atlantic coast. Basque architecture is these red beams, red painted beams with the white in between. So this is French Basque country, but all the signs are both in Basque and in French. Basque is a very interesting language. It is not related to any other language in Europe. There's no etymology that is connected. So very interesting. We were at the Pyrenees, right? Pau is at the foothills of the Pyrenees. So in the foreground is Fatma, one of Patrick's PhD students who defended this past winter, just a couple months ago, and Patrick. So he took us both hiking and picnicking up in the high mountains. It was just an hour drive away, but it was wonderful. There was still snow. This was early March. My family got to come and join, so my wife and 2 daughters. They got to live in France for 3 months, not speaking French. Well, my girls. My wife does speak French. So this was definitely a learning experience for them as well. We got to go to Venice. Yay! Right? When you're in Europe, you might as well try to get to other places and see the world, especially with teenagers. This is the view from Pau. So this is downtown Pau. This is Boulevard des Pyrénées. And those are the Pyrenees Mountains you see in the background. So this town was really, its heyday was the early 1900s. This is where all of the British aristocrats would come and visit because this is tropical for Brits. There are palm trees in Pau. It's exotic. This is the institute where Patrick works. So this is the building of the teacher prep school where he works. And it's a state school, so this is University of Bordeaux affiliated, but magnificent building because Europe. I gave a presentation of our current work at the University of Bordeaux, and this is the room where I gave the talk. University of Bordeaux. Yeah, go figure. So this is the building where I gave the talk at the University of Bordeaux. This is the resort in the Alps where I did the week-long learning workshop and symposium. It was wonderful. So people went on snowshoe hikes in the morning, and we got together and worked on didactics all day and had coffee and chatted. And it was really, really cool getting to know a lot of the people that I'd read the articles of, and I can collaborate. I have an entire group of, a network of people that I can go to with questions. Just marvelous. Great resource. Wonderful opportunities. This is the town of Arcachon near Bordeaux, but it's on a bay off of the Atlantic. This is where most of the oysters in France are raised. So if you're an oyster lover, you'll want to go check out Arcachon. About 10 miles away from this town is the highest sand dune in Europe. Now, while we were in Pau, they had a carnival. Now, usually carnival happens for Mardi Gras, but because of COVID, it had been delayed for 2 years. And so they did it in June, and so we got to see it, and it was absolutely crazy. So they have these huge puppets, and at the end, so they tell a story, they go to different parts of town, they tell more of the stories, they have dancers, people on stilts everywhere, and at the very end, they burn some of the biggest puppets in a massive bonfire. It's a thing, apparently. Big cows. We got to go to London too, Natural History Museum, absolutely stunning. Big Ben, for those who are mentioning, oh, sorry, Westminster, for those mentioning this earlier. This is the church in Saint-Jean-de-Luz where Louis XIV was married. This is the chapel where they were married. Yeah, just this is more of Saint-Jean-de-Luz. So this is kind of a coastal town in the Basque Country. It's kind of the French capital for surfing, just because it's where the Atlantic kind of comes in at a neck. And beautiful beach. It's kind of a protected bay in there. So we got there on a Friday afternoon, took a bus there from Pau, took us just a couple hours. And it was 10 p.m. and the girls just had to get their feet in the water because it was warm and it was May. And we're from Michigan, so 70s and warm feels great. So the chateau where Henry IV was born, Henri de Navarre, in case you're a history buff. This is a moat, and this is the main castle. And it's right there in the heart of Pau. And this is the turtle shell where Henry IV was put to sleep every night. There's a story there. We went to Lourdes. This is the view from our apartment as we were there. So that is all the pictures I have for you. Thank you.